Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today for this webinar, the No One Behind Inclusion, Gender and Sustainable Development. My name is Fumi Nakamura from UN Women Regional Office, representing issue-based coalition on gender equality on behalf of 13 UN agencies and entities today to facilitate this webinar. And also thank you for UNFPA Regional Office for hosting this webinar with IT support from same. And before we go into the details, please make sure you mute your microphone unless you want to speak up. And while we are doing the presentation, please use the chat box if you have questions or comments as we go on. And as some of you know, this is the second webinar that we are organizing out of 3 webinars on gender SDG based on the regional guidance note on gender SDG that we developed last year with IBC gender member and also the ISO who's going to be leading the presentation later. So today we're focusing on the leave no one behind principle, how we can integrate this principle better in the SDG for the more effective implementation. And just for the information, the third webinar is coming up on March 6th as well, focusing on addressing gender equality and child rights throughout the life cycle of this. So as I said, today's webinar, we're focusing on the leave no one behind principle to discuss how we can better integrate this principle on SDG implementation. And I will be presenting some good practices of identifying and engaging vulnerable groups, and also intersectionality with other factors as well as gender equality on the SDG processes. So in terms of the structure of today's webinar, first we will have a presentation by ISO, and then we'll open up the floor for question and answer, and also we would like to invite all the participants from all other countries in the region to share good practices and lessons learned, if any, relating to the leading no one behind principle on SDG. And then also just one point, after this webinar, we'll be sharing the presentation as well as a recording of this webinar. So those of you who couldn't make it or the colleagues, then you can share those materials later. So quickly on the ISO, who will be presenting this PowerPoint presentation today. She was the leading author together with IBC gender member agency, developed this regional guidance on gender SDG last year. And she has extensive experience on gender equality work, particularly in this region as well as other states. And so we would like to give floor to ISO to give us the overview of the presentation. Over to you, ISO.
Thank you very much, Fumi. Thank you for the introduction. And I'd like to thank everyone who found time today to participate in this webinar. Can you all hear me well?
We don't want to come back.
Can you hear me?
Yes. What time do we have to go to this meeting?
And you will see the presentation on your screen, I assume, in a minute.
I said we cannot see the presentation. If it is okay with you, I can put the presentation from our side.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, whichever is convenient.
Okay. Please stop sharing and I will present from outside.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I have to apologize for some reason I cannot see the chat messages. So if there is anything urgent, just voice it out. Please tell me if you have any questions, and do not hesitate to interrupt.
Can you see the
We want
presentation,
to.
Arsene?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Can the audience see the presentation now?
Yes.
Yeah, they should see it.
Okay.
For the
Can I
next
start?
slide, please, if you can say next, I will move to next slide.
Excuse me, I can't hear you very well.
For the to move between the slide, if you say next, I will go to next slide. Okay.
I'm sorry, but I cannot hear you that well.
And let me check if we are.
Hello, do you hear us?
Hello? Yeah, now I can hear a little better now. May I start?
Please.
Go ahead. Yes, we are saying the moment you want to change the slide, just give us instruction. Next slide, and we will move.
I am really sorry, but it keeps breaking. The microphone speech.
And so, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Somehow it's sharing my presentation again. Should I stop it, or you're happy with it the way it is? Okay. Okay, I'm starting then. So the title for our webinar, as Fumi mentioned, is Leaving No One Behind, Inclusion, Gender, and Sustainable Development. And to keep it simple, we will be moving, the progress of the webinar will be as following. We will look into the principle of leaving no one behind. We will examine how it overlaps with the mechanisms within sustainable development goals that allow us to promote gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. We will look at intersectionality and other concepts that help us to apply leaving no one behind in SDG implementation. And then we will move to practical issues of how it's best to incorporate leaving no one behind and gender equality into 4 stages of SDG implementation that we outlined in our guidance note. May we go to the next slide, please? Right. This is a short description of what we were trying to achieve with the guidance note. It was developed in 2017, as Fumi mentioned, by the Issue-Based Coalition on Gender Equality. It is specifically meant for UN country teams and partners in our region, in the Europe and Central Asia region. And what we were trying to do is give practical guidance on how to incorporate the gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in SDG implementation, which we split in 4 steps. It's the document and the preparation of it was very interactive as a process. We benefited from lessons learned and tips and recommendations that were generously shared by UN country teams in the region. And here's the link for you if you want to go and look at it again, or maybe for the first time. Because the process was so interactive, and because we really realized that the experiences, the local experiences of SDG implementation are a very rich pool that keeps expanding, we wanted to continue this conversation. So the Issue-Based Coalition came up with the idea of webinars And we already had 2. This is our 3rd one. If we may move to the next slide, please. Obviously, I don't want to dwell a lot on the Sustainable Development Agenda because you all are well aware of it. The one detail that really strikes me most is that we only have less than 5,000 days left. When you look at it in terms of days, you realize that it's a very ambitious agenda, and we do not really have that much time left till its finish line. For the purposes of current webinar, several characteristics of this new vision for the world presented in 2030 Sustainable Agenda, these few characteristics that are important for us are that it is comprehensive, people-centered, that it is very focused on equality and inequality issues, that is rooted in respect to human rights, and that it draws a lot on the view of the planet, of development, that is based on the idea of interconnectedness and interdependency. Next, please. So the way the principle of leaving no one behind is formulated in Sustainable Development Agenda is important for us because it really offers main features of what the approach, the principle embraces. If you look at the quote, what it focuses on is that on this great collective journey, we need to make sure that no one is left behind, and the necessity for it really came from the lessons of Millennium Development Goals, where the research and the voices from all across the globe demonstrated that development was there, but not everyone could share in the benefits of it in a full and equitable manner. So what we realized was that there is this trap of averages where we look at an average indicator and we assume that it shows us progress that this country is making, and we assume that the picture that we have in front of us is a full picture, but in reality the improvement of the situation of probably certain privileged groups can also pull this average up, while the situation, the condition of those who are left behind really did not show much improvement. So because of this realization, Sustainable Development Agenda undertook upon itself to implement a very different approach, the approach that ensures and uses the mechanisms in its vision to expand the fruits of sustainable development to everyone, to focus on these outliers, on those who are not the average, on those who have actually been left outside, have been marginalized, and really do not have many channels to access this development benefits. And another part that I would like to focus on in this formulation of what is leaving no one behind is this very ambitious claim of reaching the furthest behind first. Now, the reason they had to formulate it this way is because if the distribution of the fruits of development continues the way it was, then this inequality gap that is one of the main challenges of current agenda, global agenda, will stay the same, because the pace of engaging in the benefits of development will continue being the same it was. Those who are behind will continue getting a very, very small access to it, and those who are privileged will continue benefiting most. So the prioritizing became a very important element of leaving no one behind principle. If we may go to the next one. I will show you the main features, the main characteristics that leaving no one behind principle brings to SDG vision. Well, first of all, it reinforces the idea of inclusivity, expanding the benefits to all, giving voice to everyone. Then it also focuses on the idea of the development to be sustainable has to be equitable. It has to be based on understanding that formal equality does not solve the problem. And those of us in gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls area know it very well. We know very well that formal equality does not solve the issues, that it has to look into additional structural barriers that certain groups experience, that the playing field is by no means same for everyone. And then, as I said, it's the idea of setting priorities, of prioritizing the most excluded groups, of accelerating, of having to accelerate their development in order to bring them to the level where the average is. We may move to the next one. It also stresses the idea of empowering vulnerable groups. I will not dwell on it too much right now because we have the whole section dedicated to it. So then the question is, why should we focus on those left behind? Apart from the general principle of the respect of human rights, of the idea that everyone deserves being a part of this process of the development is sustainable when it's rooted in respect to human rights. Apart from this general framework, there were very specific challenges that are still there and that MDGs did not address to the full extent. Looking at our region, we can say that as in other parts of the world, income inequality is becoming more and more and more of a concern. It's at all-time, the income inequality is at all-time high in Europe. There's a high concentration of wealth, over-indebtedness, people living with enormous debt are really straining economic development and social development. Youth unemployment is a very grave concern for parts of our region. There is population aging in parts of our region. There is a youth bulge that enters workforce and is not finding decent work. That is another concern. So we have these groups that are definitely not benefiting from overall growth, although, I mean, our region went through a difficult period, but now we're seeing how it's recovering, and we want to make sure that this recovery benefits all. Then another idea is this increasing interconnectedness, realization that economy is becoming global, that there are communications that connect us as never before, that everyone can affect everyone, that something happening somewhere will have effects, ripple effects, which we need to understand and try to accommodate. There are big population movements that are at the moment very much presenting a range of challenges for Europe. And then another very concerning trend is the decline in democratic institutions, as described by a recent Freedom House report. For 12 years now, we are witnessing the decline in democratic institutions, which means a lot for leaving no one behind principle, because the further decline in democratic institutions means less protection for vulnerable groups. Obviously, climate change, again, connects us all and makes very important the approach embraced by Sustainable Development Framework as a whole, that resilience has to be system-wide, that you cannot lock yourself in your gated community and consider it enough and that you will be protected while the others suffer. If we look at gender inequality, trends are persistent in our region. It's a gender pay gap, it's GBV, it's vertical and horizontal gender segregation. We talk about harmful practices that are persistent, women systematically excluded from decision-making in governments despite high achievements in education and relatively high labor force participation, declining official assistance for programs that are addressing women's issues in our region, all of those combined, again, are a breeding ground for producing new vulnerabilities, groups that are left behind, that are not benefiting from growth when growth is there. May we move to the next one? Excuse me. In order to describe and examine the principle of leaving no one behind and how best to incorporate it in the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, we routinely use different terminology. Some of it has been used for years: the discrimination, multidimensional poverty. There is a very important element is the realization that inequality is a complex phenomenon, that it goes well beyond the income inequality, that we need to look at the inequality in opportunities, and we need to look into inequality in outcomes, which is directly related to the impact on people's lives. Just a small example. Here I live like 20 minutes from Baltimore, and according to the latest research, in Baltimore, when you move from one neighborhood to another, life expectancy drops 20 years. So you basically lose 20 years of life when you move from one location. You drive 10 minutes to the next neighborhood. This is an outcome of complex inequality issues that are affecting population, that are affecting those who are left behind. Two concepts that I'd like to specifically focus on for the purposes of this webinar are vulnerability, well, three actually: vulnerability, social exclusion, and intersectionality. So if we may move to the next slide, please. Vulnerability is a very important concept because it looks into risks that are higher for certain groups of the population because of physical, social, economic, and environmental factors and processes. The risks that increase the susceptibility of a community or a group of individuals or a category of people to the impacts of different harmful conditions. So the other side of vulnerability is resilience, so an ability to cope, overcome, withstand the impact of these harmful situations. When we talk about vulnerable groups, we talk about groups that are more susceptible to harmful conditions of economic, social, cultural, political, or environmental nature. Vulnerability is an outcome of a set of these factors. Can be demographic, can be geographical isolations, can be cultural factors. Another concept that is very helpful when we think about leaving no one behind is the concept of social exclusion. And social exclusion, as opposed to vulnerability, is both a process and an outcome. It involves the lack of or denial of resources, rights, goods, and services, and the inability to participate in relationships, activities that are available to majority of people in the society. It, again, can be economic, social, cultural, political arenas, and it affects the quality of life, and it affects the equity and cohesion of a society as a whole. Here it's important that the condition describes not just challenges faced by this group, but the challenges faced by the whole society, which becomes fragmented when there is a lot of social exclusion. And then the process of reversing social exclusion is social inclusion. Social exclusion as a process generates vulnerability, right? And the connection to poverty is not really direct, because you can be not poor but still socially excluded. You cannot necessarily be poor but still be vulnerable. Let's say if you're a subject of cultural discrimination. If we may move to the next one. I keep pushing my button as if I can control it. May we move to the next slide? Thank you. Sustainable Development Agenda answers the question of who are those people who are left behind. giving us this very, very general categories. There are women and girls, there are children, youth, persons with disabilities, people living with HIV/AIDS, older people, refugees, and so on. It also includes those affected by terrorism, those affected by humanitarian emergencies. Those are really broad categories. And of course, it's important to stress that, let's say, not all women and girls are necessarily in vulnerable position. Not all women and girls will be excluded. So we need to be very careful here to look at a complex of factors. We will move to examining one concept that helps us to capture this idea of complex set of factors that make a group, an individual, or a category vulnerable in a minute. Before that, I'd like to look specifically at our region, if we may move one slide further. Next slide. Thank you. So going back to our guidance note, what we did parallel to the guidance note was in 2017 we got together, and again it was commissioned by the Issue-Based Coalition on Gender, created this document that is a advocacy brief that looks into trends in gender equality that are important for our region. And we identified 9 trends. When we look at the trends, what trends help you to understand is to see how the trends that are there, that represent gender inequality, produce or may produce or will produce vulnerable groups, those who are susceptible to higher risks of or are already experiencing different conditions, harmful conditions. I see someone. Is there a question? Hello. I see. I see somebody's camera. That's why I thought maybe there is a question. I'm continuing. So on your left side of the screen, you see some, not all 9, but just some of the trends that we identified: the persisting gender pay gap, persisting occupational segregation, migration and displacement. We see the continuing problem of unpaid work. Women are very much engaged in often engaged in precarious jobs. They have low savings. They have low pensions as a result of it. There's a wave of extreme conservatism, retraditionalization in our region that brings it with itself control over women's sexuality, control over an attempt to control or restrict women's reproductive rights, women's access to public sphere, harmful practices, barriers in women's, girls' access to justice. So these trends, I tried to, on the right side, to show what type of vulnerabilities do these trends produce. What type of groups that will have problems benefiting from the fruits of sustainable development will we see? And just to name a few, this is by no means an exhaustive list. We see women in informal employment. Informal employment is a large share of economy in several countries of our region. We see, of course, GBV survivors, specifically those in remote areas where services are simply not available and where local attitudes, ingrained stereotypes prevent women from actually even acknowledging that they've been subjected to violence. A trend that is definitely looming, if not already there, as described in a very good report on aging in our region, produced, I believe, by ILO. Elderly women from poor section of society. Definitely, of course, when we talk about child marriage, we see women and girls, child brides, as definitely a vulnerable group that has no access to the institutions of justice that bears the very negative health and economic and social and psychological outcomes of this harmful practice. And another category is families of migrants, because labor migration is so big. And we know about the flows of labor migration from our region to Western Europe, from within our region, especially from Central Asia, South Caucasus to Russia. The families of migrants are a vulnerable group that are susceptible to different challenges, to different risks. There was recently a research done on children of parents who are labor migrants and children who were left behind in Ukraine and Moldova, and a range of psychological, economic, and social challenges that these children are subjected to. So this is just basically to show how the trend produces vulnerability, because for a long time, and you see this kind of attitude in MDGs to a certain extent, the idea was that there is poverty and we will overcome this poverty. And poverty kind of was imagined as something that will be soon addressed, but it's a thing of a past that this kind of lingers and persists. What SDGs do, and it's very different as an approach, is it looks at how development generates vulnerable groups when it's done in a certain way. How what the majority does actually generates and affects these vulnerable groups. How these persistent trends are there, not because they're a thing of the past that just kind of lingers, but because of policies, practices, the way market is organized and is operating, because of all these conditions coming together and continuing this production of new vulnerabilities, or even technological challenges. We all know, just to bring an example, how the development of internet, interconnectedness of everyone, social networks, how suddenly we see vulnerability of women and girls to sexual harassment online, to stalking, how suddenly GPS systems become a tool for violence perpetrators. So these challenges continue producing vulnerabilities. We may go to the next slide. Thank you. To just look at one example on how the trend produces exclusion and produces vulnerability, we have 54% of all international migrants in Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia are women. And the way it works is illegal labor migration generates a range of groups that are left outside of social protection systems, of labor contracts, of access to justice, of public health and education. So even when in this country there is an improvement in all of these mechanisms, women and girls and men and boys who are illegal labor migrants will not be able to benefit from it because they are excluded legislatively, physically, on the policy level. They're excluded from benefiting from this development benefits. With women and girls, the gender aspect of it is specifically also important, because when we look at women and girls and how they're very often working as domestic help, we have another level of exclusion. And this level of exclusion is specifically caused by the fact that they are not part of working collective, but they are isolated in the private area of home. So there is very little communication with fellow workers. There is inability to enter any kind of agreements. There is a difficulty in entering any type of collective agreements. Just to bring you an example, in Jordan recently, there was, with the help of United Nations and the International Labour Organization specifically, I believe, they managed to include migrant workers into give them the ability to enter collective agreements that local workers were a part of, so that they could bargain for their labor rights. So women are subjected to an additional level of exclusion. When we talk about vulnerability produced by this trend, here you have heightened risk of being subject to sexual violence, sexual exploitation for women and girls, abuse of labor rights for all, being subjected to physical violence, just to name a few. So this is the mechanism of the trend producing exclusion and ending up in creating these vulnerable groups that are left behind. We may go to the next one now. When we look at how this process works and how the principle produces these vulnerabilities, those who are left behind, we need to look at the drivers of inequality. The use of social, political, and economic power in order to exclude specific categories of people or communities can turn specific characteristics into grounds for discrimination and exclusion. Obviously, gender acts historically commonly, it's a social marker for imposing additional barriers to access to resources, opportunities, decision-making, very often for women and girls. But there are situations when it's men and boys. Race is a historically socially constructed ground for discrimination. If we go back to our region, migration status currently serves as one of the key predictors of social exclusion for young people in Europe. Here we have actually a combination of two factors of being a migrant and being of certain age, so age and migration status combined. Generally, all types of shocks, be it an economic crisis, be it a social upheaval, be it a political turmoil, ecological disaster, are very likely to exacerbate inequality, to make those already existing barriers of exclusion even harder to trespass. We also can look at deeply ingrained modes of, let's say, the way, once again, the way the market operates. We can look at how the stereotypes that are cultural stereotypes, if we look at the wave of retraditionalization in our region, how it exacerbates inequality because it purposefully excludes certain group from access to resources, opportunities, and decision-making. The important lesson to take from this is also that very often these factors combine and produce this cumulative, this aggregate effect. Several factors cause strengthened exclusion, more severe exclusion. They reinforce inequality. They increase vulnerability. Now, in order to capture, to better understand this idea of multiple layers of inequality, we will move to the next slide and look into the concept of intersectionality. As many concepts that are used by wide circles in academia and international development, intersectionality really became kind of overburdened with meanings recently, so it's always good to go back to its roots. Look at how it first was formulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar and who was working on a legal case, discrimination against African American women workers, when she felt that there is a need to address this situation, that this situation has not been described. The reason is because there were policies to protect workers, to protect African American workers. There were policies to protect women, but the employers were specifically discriminating against African American female workers. And when challenged, they were saying, well, you know, we have women, there are white women that we hire, so I don't see what your problem is. We have African American men that we hire, I don't see what your problem is. So Kimberly Crenshaw thought about this image that would describe this intersecting, this overlapping layers of discrimination. And she came up with the idea of the metaphor of intersection. You see the picture of intersection here. If you drive a car, or if you drive in a car, if you ride in a car, you probably had this situation where you have several lines of traffic and they intersect. And if there's no light, you're kind of standing there waiting and you're looking at people on the other sides and thinking, okay, will anybody move? So the way she imagines is that these lines of traffic, each of those are certain avenue of discrimination, of inequality. And here right in the middle is the area where they all intersect. And if you're standing in this area, you are subjected to multiple inequalities. So it's important that they overlap, that they intersect. That's what this concept gives us. It gives us this language to examine the situations, which is very important for looking into vulnerable groups, because very often that's where we see these layers of inequality, these intersecting avenues of inequality. It can be gender-based, it can be racial, it can be class-based. But another important part of this concept is that look at this center, it's this gray zone where the rules are unclear, where the group itself may be invisible because nobody thinks about them. Because the majority thinks that, okay, these groups are all taken care of, and they prefer to or just are not aware of these multiple vulnerabilities, multiple inequalities that affect this specific category, group of people. Which renders them invisible, which is an additional challenge of reaching those left behind, because they're often invisible in public discourse, in policy discourse. And finally, it shows us this aggregate effect of what happens when they all kind of pile up together. If we could go to the next slide. Just to give a very, very really simple example, in reality, of course, we're dealing with much more complex situations. But if you have, let's say, a refugee camp, and you have local settlement there, right nearby, in local settlement, you will have a certain probably prevalence rate of violence against women. You will have possibly limited mobility, maybe, for women and girls. You will have limited access to family resources because of patriarchal structures in the family or in the community. You will have all of those possibly in the refugee camp, but in addition, you are likely to see ethnicity, religion, language-based discrimination. You may see very limited mobility, like legislatively, because they're not allowed by law to leave the camp. You will see no access to resources but through male head of household. And you will see definitely increased risk of GBV, of sexual violence, because there is really no law, no protection. So if we look at our region, 26% of women in Eastern Europe, 23% in Central Asia experience either physical or sexual violence by intimate partner or sexual violence by non-partner. Now, if we look at the crisis-affected areas, we all know that there is an increased risk of being subjected, exposed to gender-based violence. According to some estimates, for example, IDP women in Ukraine 3 times higher is the risk, is the prevalence rate. If we could go to the next slide. So that shows us this multiple layers of inequality. Now, a word of caution, which is what this slide is dedicated to, about using the language of vulnerability when we are dealing with the issues of gender inequality. For some time now, scholars and academics and practitioners working in the field of gender equality and women's rights were expressing some concern with the idea of vulnerability, or rather with the way it may be used. And I have here two columns that kind of describe how it can be used and how it should be used. Idea of vulnerability has this risk of reinforcing stereotypes, especially when it comes to societies where women and girls are routinely described as passive, dependent, in need of assistance. So the idea of them being vulnerable may work to reinforce the stereotypes. That's one danger. Another danger is that when we work with vulnerable groups, I experienced it many times in my career, when we work with vulnerable groups, Sometimes the idea of, especially in humanitarian settings, is that these groups are kind of imagined as homogeneous, and there is little understanding that within these groups, women may have less voice, less access. They be much more excluded and much more dependent because the representation of the group is done by men, by more powerful, connected, sometimes older men. So when we think about vulnerability, we definitely need to, when we work with these groups, we need to use the intersectional approach to imagine, to analyze, examine what are these additional inside group dynamics that add exclusion within the group itself. Right. So this the problem with this approach may be that it mitigates the voices of women through other agents, that other agents act as representatives, that it ignores existing assets, stresses the vulnerability. I'll talk about it a little later, how important it is for us to definitely focus on resilience as much as we focus on vulnerability. And it results in reaching across the borders of exclusion rather than dismantling the borders, empowering women. Right? The way to productively use this very good concept of vulnerability is to look at these groups not as just as those susceptible to risk, but also as agents of change, agents of empowerment, to imagine women as resilient, able to mobilize support, able to talk directly and voice whatever interests and problems they have. To capitalize on existing assets and stress the resilience and empower women. This is what inclusive development is about. So if we may move on now. Just to bring you an example, child marriage, of course, is an example of intersectional drivers of inequality, intersectional layers of inequality, because it has gender discrimination that intersects with poverty sometimes, definitely social exclusion, sometimes can be geographical exclusion, tradition, presence of violent conflict, refugee status can contribute. And then there is this heightened risk of vulnerability, because if the girl is poor, lives in a rural, geographically isolated area, the community is patriarchal, there is an exclusion from the access to justice mechanism, education and healthcare. If there is if there's a threat of forced displacement, if resources are distributed through very specific narrow channel that is controlled by certain power holders in this community, that increases the risk of a girl becoming a subject of sexual exploitation or becoming a child bride. And of course, it is associated, it's not that the vulnerability doesn't stop there. It produces additional challenges, additional vulnerabilities, because as it's associated with early school dropout, with early pregnancy, with negative economic health and social outcomes. And as to the challenges, we already talked about that some of these groups will be invisible because authorities are not interested in reporting it, because families are interested in hiding it, because it's a culturally sensitive issue. So the challenge of addressing it is preceded by a challenge of actually identifying it. If we could move, please. Now I'd like to move us to look at the connections between twin track approach of incorporating gender equality into the SDG framework and leaving no one behind principle. There are many points of connection there. First of all, gender equality routinely, as we said, inequality generates new vulnerable groups. So it's a generator of vulnerabilities, basically. Secondly, standalone goal, SDG 5, and mainstreaming of gender equality through SDG network actually exhibits really well how SDG framework embraces the idea of intersecting systems of oppression, intersecting systems of inequality, and how it emphasizes the role of gender inequality in this complex setting. Third, gender equality is an accelerator in the progress of vulnerable groups. Why is it happens? It's a very important point. As I said, when we stop looking at vulnerable group as homogeneous, if we understand that within it there are its own levels of additional exclusion, then when we specifically target those within the group that are subjected to exclusion, we accelerate the progress of the whole group, because we basically are going for those who are most furthest behind, to quote the Sustainable Development Agenda. Next, this is a power of gender equality as an accelerator. The next point is that there is an interaction of gender inequality with other forms of inequality and the aggregate effect. That's why within Sustainable Development Goals, we often see if it is a concern is like in SDG 1, a poverty reduction, we see specifically mentioned women, for example, because there is a realization, there is an understanding within this SDGs that this is a group that experiences this aggregate cumulative effect of several inequalities, complex mechanisms of exclusion. And finally, it emphasizes restrictions on access to justice, services, and mobility in public space for women and girls. So it does dwell on this idea of exclusion and in its gender dimension. Gender-based exclusion from benefits of development is very much formulated within SDG framework. So we have it there, ready for us to use. Next slide, please.
I'm so sorry to disturb you. Knowing the time constraint, it would be great if you could be quicker.
I cannot, I am really sorry, but I cannot hear you.
Let's unmute. Can you tell?
Aisha, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I will
sorry.
try.
Just concerning the time, we would appreciate
Yeah.
if you can just
We'll skip some. There are some that are just pictures, so don't worry.
Okay, great, because we want to make sure we have a time for discussion
Absolutely.
as well with the participants.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
All right, okay. So if we may move to the next one. Right, this is just an example of how several SDGs combined actually address a very specific situation: the loss of a key employer, workforce is pushed into informal employment, all workers experience pay cuts, unlimited hours, no weekends because there is no regulation. However, women in addition experience lower payment, experience sexual harassment, and so on. So this is a group, rural women in informal employment, definitely with heightened vulnerability, which is addressed through several SDGs and connections between them. We may move to the next one. This is just basically summarizing what we've been talking about up to this point, that sustainable development has to be inclusive and equitable. This is a message of SDGs, that it needs to eliminate structural conditions, that it needs inclusive policies, equitable institutions, that it prioritizes. And one important point that we haven't talked about yet is that one of the ways to address this is to improve data collection, sharing, and analysis, highlighting vulnerable group, and avoiding, as we said, the trap of averages, listening to those excluded. And it kind of has two conversations. One is with those who are excluded, and the other one, sometimes much more difficult conversations, is with the majority that is doing relatively fine. Because as I said, very often the awareness of these vulnerable groups is not sufficient in the society. So if we may go to the next one. Now zooming into the SDG framework, just as an example, how is leaving no one behind principle actually embraced in different SDGs? We see SDG 5. It has 2 targets that look at vulnerable groups, well, actually 3 targets, and it has indicators that specifically measure the impact on vulnerable groups, on those left behind. So those are mechanisms that are within the policy framework that are SDGs, and these mechanisms are helping us to address these vulnerable groups, those left behind. If we could move to the next one. So the same goes for, let's say, another example, SDG 6. This is about water and sanitation for all. And again, please pay attention how Target 6.2 pays special attention to women and girls in vulnerable situations. Because in remote rural locations, in refugee camps, women have this problem of unsafe access to water source, sanitary facilities. We have an indicator that is, they suggest to disaggregate by sex and age. One additional indicator may be to look at specifically women and girls in remote rural communities. If we could move further, one slide further, please. Same about SDG 1, and here I really would like to just give an example of when you work, and especially when you do qualitative research, you just come across these vulnerabilities that you never even thought of. I had a focus group, and I was in Azerbaijan, where we were looking at women who were poor and elderly, and then suddenly, after the trust was already built, we discovered that there is this additional group. These are older women that are basically illiterate because of the change of alphabet. They could never learn new alphabet, so they can't read in Latin alphabet. And the stigma of being illiterate is so high in this society because these women are also elderly that they are really shy and very embarrassed to admit it. So they could not read the documents that would explain to them how to start their business, and there were opportunities for that specifically. They couldn't read documents that would help them with their social protection. So this is just, you would just come across this, especially in qualitative research, additional vulnerability factors. If we could move to the next one. Another example is SDG 16. I will not really dwell on it. Basically, the important part of it here is that it stresses the access. The access is a very important channel of reducing vulnerability and exclusion. If we could go one further. This is a country example of a very good program that was conducted in Kyrgyzstan, where the high burden of paid legal consultation and representation excluded men and women. There was a lack of lawyers in remote locations, and they did a thing called Solidarity Bus, where they provided free legal aid to remote villages. UNDP was local NGO, LBD Consulting, 18,000 oral and written consultations. So this is a way of bringing services to the excluded group. We could move on. This is just a link for you. It's a shared United Nations system framework for action. You will find many descriptions of general concepts that we talked about in this document, probably not specific for our region, but it's a good source to have. It has some tools for equality analysis, for measuring and monitoring. So you will have it. It has a link here. If we could move on. Now this is this is basically my favorite part of the presentation, because look at the picture. What's wrong with this picture? And that is an example of how people are not really even aware of what sometimes of the exclusions that they have. It's the hands that are holding letters forming word inclusion. Now if you notice, all hands are exactly the same. It's the irony of it. I thought was very interesting. So what are the challenges in identifying those left behind? Insufficient, incoherent data. Specific categories, as I said, remain invisible, and the instruments that we use are inadequate to capture them. Some topics may be sensitive. Society doesn't want to discuss them. There is a resistance of the majority, and it's especially significant in gender-related issues because sometimes these vulnerabilities are considered a part of national tradition. Bias against the outcomes of qualitative research. Many of you have encountered it, where people are telling you, well, this is a very small group of people. Well, yes, this is how we do it in qualitative research very often, but that allows us to dig deeper, and that's how we actually find these vulnerable groups that nobody else saw before. Resistance to allocating funding, because these groups of those left behind sometimes are fairly small groups. You may encounter donor indifference. You may encounter the apathy of political actors who do not consider it a juicy enough subject for them to address. And another concern is the lack of economic interest from the private sector actors. So those are all challenges. Now, if we could move on and look at some solutions. And the solutions are relying on existing body of research and local expertise, on working with local activists and NGOs who hear from people and sometimes have firsthand information about this newly emerged challenges, starting with small-scale, in-depth qualitative studies that allow you to dig deeper and build trust and actually let people tell you what are these underlying challenges. Citizen-generated data definitely is something that is used by many right now. It's when citizens are using mobile technology to send messages, send videos, and alert development actors about this new excluded groups that are out there and nobody even knows about them. And then re-examining existing databases. This is what a think tank called ODI did with, in Kenya, they just went to demographic and health survey and started looking at certain cross-tabulations, certain intersections of different variables that nobody looked at before. So they used what was already there, the database that was already there, to look at the access to quality healthcare. And I have the picture of a fossil here because you just dig what is already there. That is, in funding-wise, also doesn't require too big of a funding. We could move on. Now, here I have several examples of tools that you can all look on. This is more of an indication of what you can look on. Social exclusion surveys, good for our region because we had it in 2009. It covered 6 countries. It has 3 dimensions. It looks at economic, social services, civic participation. Gender component's a little weak there, in my opinion. And it uses the idea of exclusion chain, like different levels of exclusion. So you may want to look at that. It's online. If we could move on. There is an Oxfam vulnerability and risk assessment tool. Here I give you a link. A very good tool to use. There are barrier studies. I've done several myself. You're looking at the barriers and facilitating factors that are stopping some communities or certain groups within the community from accessing services. And it's very good to combine it with the organizational gender-sensitive analysis of the services themselves, of service providers. When you combine the two, it's very good in producing the analysis of bottlenecks, of gaps in access to services, and thus it gives us an idea of exclusion and vulnerability of those left behind. Very important is resilience studies, asset-based community development framework. It specifically focuses not just on needs, but also on what communities have, on successful examples. And job quality index, that's in Turkey, was done. It's a very interesting study. I highly recommend. We could move on. Another just example of how one can analyze a program or organization using inclusion lens is done by Wash Alliance International. Here you have a link. It looks at participation, it looks at influencing decisions, making decisions, so basically looks at steps. We could move on. That's another tool that you can look at. And if we talk about 4 steps of SDG implementation that we have in our guidance note, let's move on and look at what can be done at every step of it. So with developing inclusive vision for how we nationalize and localize SDGs, vulnerable groups, ensuring their participation in discussions is very important. Macedonia is a very good example. Again, I will refer you to our guidance note. We have a description of how it was done there with Macedonia We Want project platform. Lithuania did a very good job with SDG ambassadors, where ordinary people were telling different, sometimes very excluded groups about SDGs and what SDGs can do for addressing vulnerabilities. Another thing to do is get vulnerable groups covered in nationalized and localized targets and indicators. Just look at them and see if groups that are vulnerable, that are relevant for the country, are included in those. Vulnerable groups are identified, prioritized in strategies and action plans. Again, it takes, in the process of writing it, it takes to just make sure that the certain groups of population are being covered, are not being left outside of the process, making a case for the private sector engagement through the idea of diversity, which is proven by research to increase actually the revenues of companies if a company pays attention to diversity, and diversity is about embracing different groups within the population, and including leaving no one behind in SDG education. That is also successfully done, especially through mobile telephone networks, which, given how high is the subscription to mobile telephones in our region, that is a very productive way to address it. If we could move on. Institutional mechanisms for SDG implementation, every country has one, and obviously representation of vulnerable groups is very important. We have examples in our region of NGOs getting together and having mechanisms for ensuring that accountability of the governments and SDG implementation mechanisms to the population. There's a 40 NGO network. There is a network of European NGOs that looks into it. Ensuring that part of implementation mechanism, for example, task force, is charged specifically by addressing leaving no one behind. Georgia is a good example. They have technical groups. They have a technical group within their implementation mechanism. They have technical group on gender equality, and they have technical group on social inclusion. Another way is to involve community-based councils with representatives of vulnerable groups. For example, Slovenia did it with local NGOs that are involved in national Roma integration strategy, and they are part of community-based councils that are advising on local implementation of SDGs. And of course, capacity building. When we're doing capacity building for, let's say, government officials or NGOs that are represented in SDG Council, SDG Implementation Task Force, definitely including training on policy for vulnerable groups, how to address vulnerable groups when you write a policy, or a training on how to use intersectional approach to setting your priorities, what we were been talking about before. These definitely can be very helpful if included in training for people who work in our institutional mechanisms for SDG implementation. And our almost last step, step 3, if we could move to the next one, is monitoring and evaluation. Here, I would very much recommend looking into, if you haven't done it yet, probably did, into an excellent source evaluating the Sustainable Development Goals with a no one left behind lens through equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluations by Bamberger and Segon and Tateusian. Here is a link for you. Again, use of disaggregated data is very important. Drawing on existing information about intersectional drivers of inequality. For example, you may look at monitoring framework that UN Habitat created for SDG 11. It's a very good tool. Asking specifically when you put together your evaluation framework, did I ensure that the vulnerable groups come first? Basically looking even at your action plan. Okay, are they before? Are they there? Are they prioritized? Evaluating impact and progress of those left behind. So we look at the impact of our SDG implementation. But we also need to look at the progress that these vulnerable groups make. Is it the same pace as the mainstream? Is it slower? Is it faster? Obviously, baselines that we use for vulnerable groups should be different from those that we use for national averages, right? Because they start with a much more grim situation. Specific set of sources and instruments, and here we need to think about additional funding that may be needed for that. Because even to identify the group, you may need to do some additional qualitative or digging, let's say, into existing databases. Results for vulnerable group and mainstream should be comparable. So we need to make sure that the methodology, albeit kind of different, but should be comparable. And then adjusting evaluating frameworks as new vulnerable groups are identified. So there should be this flexibility that allows us to add new groups, because new groups will continue emerging. If we could move to the next one. And finally, our last stage is reporting, reflecting the twin track approach to gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls is imperative in our reports, very important. Examining intersectional exclusion and heightened vulnerability is another principle. Showing if vulnerable excluded groups were prioritized, if they were not, why not? Demonstrating the rate of progress, which our evaluation framework should allow us to do if we included necessary mechanisms in it. Vulnerable groups compared to mainstream. Okay, what is the rate of progress? Suggesting acceleration measures. If, let's say, we do not achieve the rate of progress that we need, what can be done? What kind of acceleration measures can we recommend? That should go into recommendation section of reports. Suggesting adjustments to SDG implementation priorities for new categories of those left behind. Right? If we see these new vulnerable groups, we need to make sure that in our recommendations, we suggest whatever adjustments are needed to expand our efforts to cover these new vulnerable groups. If we could move to the next one. And finally, the Regional Forum on Sustainable Development of the UNECE region will be held on Thursday, 1st March, and Friday, 2nd March 2018. It's an entry point for entering the discussions on how to ensure that we are leaving no one behind in our efforts, and how to ensure that leaving no one behind is well interlinked with the twin track approach to gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. So here's the link for you. I'm finished, and I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Aisel. It was a great presentation covering starting from concept to the country example, additional tools and resources. So due to the limited time, we have about 15 minutes left. So let's open up the floor to the participants to see if any of you has questions or general comments or any additional country example you could share. If anyone wants to speak up, please unmute. Otherwise, you can type up your comments, question in the comment box as well. Anyone?
And I'd like to add that I see 12 chat messages. If there are any questions in them, I will definitely look at them after we're finished.
No, there's no specific question or comment. So
okay, because I can't look at them right now.
Right. We have about more than 20 participants. Let's see if anyone has questions or comments or any country example to share. Anyone? Since everyone is quiet.
One of the challenges is that it's such a big topic, such a complex topic. And of course, the presentation touched upon so many issues that sometimes I think it's overwhelming, and I can completely understand that.
Yeah, okay. Maybe someone. One question. No question. Thank you so much. It was very useful. Okay, thank you for covering this complex topic. Okay. Anyone else? Great, very useful. Okay, great. Thank you. No one has questions, comments? Or any colleagues at the country level who is specifically addressing leave no one behind principle in their work? Anything to share? Okay, seems like none. Aisel, do you have any additional points you'd like to add or?
No, but I think maybe we should give information. I apologize if you already given it about our next webinar.
Yes, sure. So just additional information, as briefly mentioned, this was the second webinar, and then we are planning, issue-based coalition on gender together with ISAL. We organizing the next webinar, which will be on Tuesday, March 6th, from 1 o'clock to 2:30 Istanbul time. The topic will be the impact of SDGs on addressing gender inequality and child rights throughout the life cycle. So this is going to be our last joint webinar that we're currently planning within this year in line with our regional guidance on gender SDG. So hope everyone can join us again on March 6th for the third webinar. And then, as I said, we will be sharing the recording of this webinar as well as a PowerPoint presentation, so you can review the material as well as you can share with your colleagues and the rest of the GTG member in the country. Okay, there's one comment. Especially interesting to see specific example from different countries. Interesting to see. Okay, thank you. All right. All right, so I think then this is the end of today's webinar. Aisel, do you have any final points you'd like to make?
Well, just to reinforce the idea that we would really very much want to know and to share the experiences of country teams, because this is what we've done when we were preparing the guidance note, and the process continues. So it's really important for us, even let's say after this webinar, if participants will find a minute to write little notes about how in their experience, leaving no one behind is implemented within SDG implementation process in their country, that would be invaluable.
Yes, thank you so much, Aisel. So on behalf of IBC Gender, representing 13 agencies and entities, we would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar, and we hope to have you again in the next webinar on March 6th. And thank you so much, Aisel, for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.